It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Kareen Erbe of Broken Ground Permaculture. She is a garden design consultant, a homesteader, and an educator. From getting clients started on their first ever garden to working with people on designing a full-blown homestead, to designing large-scale farms, she's helped thousands of people grow nutritious food for their families through consultations and design services. And you may have heard of her signature program called the Resilient Homestead Program. And she also has a very comprehensive collection of videos on her YouTube channel. Kareen lives with her husband on a suburban homestead in Bozeman, Montana, and they have a greenhouse, a pond, vegetable gardens, a food forest with fruit trees and berry bushes, a front yard native garden that we're going to be hearing about, a flock of chickens, and a blue heeler dog named Benny. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen and I'll welcome Kareen and she can take it away. Thank you, Kareen.
Well, thank you so much, Beth, and welcome everybody. I have to say this is super heartening and really gives me a lot of hope that there are 160 people that are interested in converting their lawns into native plant gardens. So thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you to the Montana Native Plant Society for asking me to give this talk. And just a disclaimer is that I am by no means an expert in native plants. As Beth read, I do more kind of edible garden designs and both perennial edibles and vegetables. But I started this native plant project about 5 years ago in my front yard and wanted to share with people what my experience has been. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. Let's see. There we go. So maybe just a thumbs up from anyone or someone telling me whether they can see this.
That looks great. You're in presentation mode there.
Okay, wonderful. So as Beth said, my name is Kareen. I have a small business in Bozeman, Montana called Broken Ground. And there's my website there and I can share more information about it later. But I like to start out, I always like to start out my talks by acknowledging my ancestors. And the reason for that is I think, when we talk about native plants, we're talking about building resilience in our yards and gardens, right? And same with growing our own food, and it's all about resilience. And I think that resilience also means that you understand where you come from and that we settle into where we live. And I think when we take on this relationship with the land and when we take on kind of putting in native plants in our place, it's taking a relationship to where we live and settling in to where what we're calling home. And so I just wanted to acknowledge my great-grandmother up in the top left corner, Nellie Cruz, who sold turkeys and had dairy cows and sold milk and cream and also minnows from the river nearby because the land was fairly poor in Minnesota. My grandmother, Margaret Erbe, in the bottom left corner, who had a small homestead of her own. It was almost like a victory garden, and she kept a diary of what she did, and that diary was gifted to us. So I get to see what my grandma did on every day in terms of having her own garden and having chickens and having a milk cow. And then acknowledging my maternal grandmother Lau on the top right-hand corner, who was born in Malaysia and moved to Singapore and lived through the Japanese occupation as a representation of resilience and kept her family safe. And then I'm my mom in the bottom right-hand corner, who is emigrated to Canada in her 20s and took on a whole new life as an immigrant in a new place. So just that whole idea of resilience is what we're going to be talking about, even though we're going to go into kind of the nuts and bolts of how to convert a lawn. But I like to always start there. So as Beth mentioned, we live on a suburban home, or a suburban yard in Bozeman, Montana. We have a greenhouse, we have a pond that captures water off of our roof and grows aquatic plants. We have an annual garden. We have a food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes, and these are some of the yields that come out of that food forest. And we have this native front yard pollinator garden that I'm going to talk about this evening. Have some chickens, and my husband is also a hunter, and so with the vegetables and the fruit and the eggs, we grow a good portion of our own food. So that's kind of a little bit about me. And I wanted to go into, but I don't think I have to make an argument, right? Obviously, people who have heard of this, they're either members of the Montana Native Plant Society or, are interested in native plants. So, just for those of you who don't know, for the few people that might not know, why do we want to put native plants in our landscape? Well, they require less water and maintenance. They've obviously evolved to thrive in our region. Again, that resilience piece that I talked about. And then they attract native pollinators, they increase biodiversity, and they're a lifeline to native fauna. And I'm sure many of you have, heard of Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope. And just this whole idea that we, as individuals and as individuals who may have access to land, who have the privilege to steward our little piece of land, can contribute to this whole idea of increasing biodiversity, and it's kind of a hopeful action that each of us can take. So let's get into some of the 6 steps that I've outlined for converting your lawn into a native plant garden. And obviously this is how I look at it. Obviously you don't have to go through the steps as I have, but this helps me kind of think through how to explain to people what to do. So first step is to choose a site, preferably that has full sun with access to water. And we're going to go through all of these steps in more detail. Second step is to make a site plan that's to scale and to research plant species. Third step is to scrape your lawn. Fourth step is to establish pathways, irrigation, and place the plants. Fifth step is to plant and put down mulch. And then sixth step is to just be mindful about watering for those first 3 to 4 years. And I will say, if people do have, I don't know, Beth, how we want to do this, but if people have questions as we're going along, or do we want to reserve questions until the end? I'm good either way.
Well, I think it's a pretty big group, and if people want to type questions into the chat, we'll kind of handle them mostly at the end. If there's something really compelling that you need pointed out, you can type it in the chat, and I can interrupt Kareen about it. But let's plan on some discussion and questions at the end, if that works.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so let's get started. Step 1, choose your site. So a lot of people go with a front lawn. A lot of people have an area already determined. I like to use what in permaculture is called zone analysis. And for those of you who aren't familiar with permaculture, permaculture stands for permanent agriculture, or permanent culture, and it's a design approach for sustainable living and land use that's rooted in the observation of natural systems. And so what you do also, the design methodology, is that you understand that we care for and maintain what we see on a daily basis. And so things like an annual vegetable garden should be close into your house. So this is our house here. This is the annual vegetable garden in the pond that we have. It's really close in, right? The chickens are here, they're close, I have to maintain them. Whereas the food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes is farther back on the site. This is where I decided to put the front yard native pollinator garden. Why? It's close to the house, right? But I don't really hang out in this front area here. This is a super busy road. And so even though it's a great microclimate, say for vegetables, I didn't want to put my vegetable garden here because I wasn't going to be hanging out in the front yard. So with a native plant garden, of course, there's there's lower maintenance needed than in a vegetable garden. So definitely think through where you want to put that um, that native plant garden. It doesn't necessarily have to be super close to the house. It does require a level of maintenance, but hopefully over time it's less and less, right? So your zone 1 in permaculture is stuff that you need daily use and care. Zone 2 is kind of weekly use. Zone 3 is, occasional use, down to the zone 5 area, which is kind of wilderness area on your site, whether that's the green ash trees, the Siberian pea shrub hedge, the lilac shrubs, something that doesn't need a lot of your maintenance over time and is mostly just wildlife habitat. So that's one good way to kind of understand and choose where your site might be. The other thing to choose is, preferably full sun, right? A lot of the native plants that we have in Montana are mostly full sun lovers. So finding somewhere that doesn't have a lot of shade. So this was our front lawn when I started. It was total full sun, nothing in the way, no trees, just a bunch of thistle and dandelion and some grass. And so that's the first step. Obviously, again, people probably know about the summer sun and the winter sun. Just again, this area right here being your ideal garden spot for native plants. Of course, there are native plants that are shade tolerant as well, but many of them aren't. So that's choosing your site, first of all. Then you want to make a site plan. And it wants to be to scale. So it doesn't have to be of the entire yard, right? Usually when clients come to me and they want to get rid of some of their lawn, it might be just the front lawn area. So you can take a thing of graph paper and just, walk out that front lawn area and be like, okay, I have a 10 by 20 foot space, or I have a 20 by 30, whatever it might be. So it doesn't have to be the whole site plan. If you happen to have a site plan that, say you had a renovation or it was a new build, then you might already have this information, but you want to make sure you have a site plan and that it's to scale, right? So that you understand how many plants you can fit in the spaces that that you're going to have, because you don't want to, native plants aren't cheap, and you don't want to, buy more than you need. You want to make sure that everything has adequate space when you plant it. So that's a second step. Make a site plan, whether it's just simple with graph paper, whether you have an existing one, have that site plan and make sure that it's to scale. Next step as part of that step 2 is you want to research plants, right? Research the plants that you want to have on your site. And there are various different resources out there. These are 2 that I really like: the Montana Native Plants for Pollinator Friendly Plantings. And I will put that in the chat. I have that pulled up and I can put that in the chat after the talk. So that's a really good resource. There's an electronic resource out there. The Montana Native Plant Society, of course, has all sorts of great resources as well in terms of native plants too. So you definitely want to do some research. For me, I wanted, obviously, drought tolerant plants. I wanted some medicinal plants. I wanted some that were pollinator plants as well. And then chose some based on, those were basically my requirements. I think when you think through the different plants that you want to put in your garden, you might also want to think through like what the goal is of having that native plant garden, right? And that might inform some of your plant choices. Is it for bird habitat? Is it for other pollinators? Is it also for medicinal use? Or is it also for your own edible use as well? So, think through some of the goals of your site. This also, for those of you in the Bozeman area, although I'm sure this would apply to different parts of Montana as well, they have a water smart planting guide. Not all of the species in there are native, of course, but they have them starred as to which ones are native. So this is a good guide. You can pick these up around town at local nurseries as well, just as another place where you can get some ideas in terms of different species. So these are some of the perennial flowers that I have in my front yard. And when I look at kind of what I put in 2018 and what really has done well and what I love, it's definitely the first four have been really great. And the so pale purple coneflower, wild bergamot or wild bee balm, prairie coneflower, blue flax, blanket flower as well has been great. Showy fleabane is awesome, and the white sagebrush has really been, those have been really great and have really taken off in my front yard space. So, and this is, again, this is something that you can screenshot if you want, and or take down when you see the replay. These are some of the shrubs that I have in the front yard. So I have buffalo berry is great. It fruited for the first time this year, which was super exciting. Rabbit brush, choke cherry, Lewis mock orange, which has been amazing. Golden currants and snowberry. And one of the things is also the reason I put shrubs in the front yard is because my front yard is very large. And so I didn't want to have to buy so many kind of wildflower plants to make it a meadow. I wanted some diversity of height as well in the front yard. So that's something to think about. And that's again why you want this site plan to scale, to think about, oh, if I do put in shrubs and they take up this much space, am I going to have enough space for the wildflower? So depending on the scale of what you're doing, you may or may not want to include shrubs in there and or trees, right? And then I put some ornamental grasses as well. Not everything in my front yard is native, but most of it is. So these are just some of the options that you have, but of course there are many, many, many more. So put a little bit of time and energy into plant research and yeah, what species will make you happy and also have benefits to our non-human species as well. So one thing that I did when I established my front yard is I did a combination of different plants, plant sizes. So I did some bare root plants for some of the shrubs that I put in, like the buffalo berry. And then I did 1-gallon pots for some of the shrubs and for some of the grasses and the rabbit brush. And then I did 6-inch plugs, mostly for the wildflowers. So for those of you who don't know what 6-inch plugs are, this is what they are. They grow, and this one is particularly root bound, but these grow they're grown in these little plugs. That makes it more affordable than having to buy, say, 4-inch pots, right? You can grow them in these yourself, or you can get them from different nurseries, and I'll be talking about that in a second. I also used some seeds for wildflowers, but what I found is that is very iffy as to whether or not those wildflower seeds will take. So I often recommend against putting too much investment in seeds because oftentimes they don't germinate, or not very many of them germinate, or, you know, for the amount, I'm sure you all have looked into, or some of you have probably looked into wildflower seeds. They're not cheap, right? So you do want having plugs, putting in plugs instead of seeds is better. It's a better investment. You're more likely, you know, that that little plant is probably going to survive, or has a much greater chance of surviving, rather than just the seeds. But those are kind of some of your options for what you would use. So plant sources, I know in Montana, Great Bear Native Plants is a really good source. They distribute in various different nurseries around Montana, but you can also, in the spring, you can also order directly from them. You can order plant packs. So they're definitely a place to keep in mind. You know, this winter, early spring, when you're kind of doing your planning for your yard. The other one is that in Livingston, or the pickup is in Livingston, but Montana Freshwater Partners, which is a nonprofit organization, does a native plant sale every year. Well, this year was their second annual native plant sale, and it's usually super successful. And so now I think are going to do it as an ongoing thing. So of course the plants are slightly more expensive because it's also a fundraiser for them. But I like this whole idea of, you know, supporting this great nonprofit that's doing wonderful work in the community while at the same time you're getting these awesome native plants. So that's another potential source. And then again, I can only speak to Bozeman, and maybe we can do a little bit of crowdsourcing in the chat for those of you who are in different parts of Montana, in terms of where you've seen native plants in your locations. But in Bozeman, obviously there's a native plant section in Cashman Nursery, at Blake Nursery, at the Garden Center at Kenyon Noble. Again, if somebody knows of other places in Bozeman where they've seen native plants, please put that in the chat. And then Circle S seeds for native wildflower seeds. There are those native plant packets, but of course, you know, as the Plant Society knows, and you know, some of those flowers aren't native in those in those in those packets. I used one of those packets, and all of the non-natives seem to have gone away. So you can use them, but it's probably better to go to somewhere like Circle S Seeds and just buy specifically like blue flax seeds, right? Rather than getting necessarily a wildflower mix. There's also, if you don't have a local source for plants, you can also go to Prairie Moon Nursery, and they have again plant packs like this, so 6-inch plugs that you can buy, and you can mix and match in terms of what you want to get. So that's also a possibility as well. So step 3. So we have chosen a site, we have made a site plan, and we know what plants we're gonna have on our site, and we've placed them. You know, I would do like a rough sketch. It doesn't have to be something pretty, right? But a rough sketch of where you want to put what on your site, just to make sure, you know, how many plants of this particular thing do you need to buy, how many plants of that particular thing, etc. So that's your second step. And then your third step is to scrape your lawn. So it depends on how you want to scrape your lawn, because ours was like it was like probably about 50 by 40 feet or larger. I made the decision to enlist my friend Luke, who's an earth worker, to have him scrape the lawn rather than trying to do that all myself. I think when you make these decisions about where to put your time and money and budget, you know, sod busting is one of the most time consuming things. You can, if it's a small space, by all means, get a work party together, friends and neighbors, feed them good food, and bust out that sod. But if it's a larger space, sometimes it's worth the investment to get an earth worker or to rent an earth moving machine and scrape it yourself. So that's what I would recommend. You could, you know, you could sheet mulch the area, you know, put cardboard on top and soil and all that kind of stuff, but that's a lot of material. And sheet mulching often is to build your soil, and you don't necessarily need to build your soil with these native plants because they're fine growing in poor soil. So you could do that, but I would actually recommend that you scrape it instead, so that you're not having to constantly battle a lot of grass. So here's Luke scraping. He made a berm on this kind of south side, along which I planted shrubs. And for those of you who are in Bozeman, many of you may be aware that you can get paid up to $2,000 if you're in the city of Bozeman for removing some of your turf. So just be aware of that resource, where you can go to bozeman.net to this, and I will put this in the chat too at the end as well, where you can get money for taking away your lot, which is a win-win. And they have all sorts of other information on there. They'll also give you rebates on buying drought-tolerant plants, on buying rain sensors, all of these different things to conserve water. So definitely for those of you in Bozeman, I'd recommend you take advantage of it. It does require, the turf removal does require a small site plan for you to come up with a site plan to give to them so that they know that you have a plan for that and you're not just, you know, scraping your lawn and running with the money. So but know that this is available. So that was step 3.
Kareen?
Yeah.
Just while you're talking about the lawn, there were a couple questions. First of all, did you leave a buffer of grass lawn next to your neighbor? And then the second one is, do you haul away the lawn you scrape or do you compost it?
Right. You can do all of those things. So I didn't, this is right here. It's funny, on the day that I decided to take these photos, my neighbor for some reason had an oven sitting on the so that, you know, shows up in a lot of these pictures. So her property is right here. So I checked with her and told her what I was doing. Asked her again, that's fundamental, right? Kind of relationships with your neighbors. I asked her what she thought about it. And the only thing she said is just don't put shrubs way in here that, you know, block my sight line for when I'm pulling out onto this busy road. And so, and she was fine with that. So I think and then that first year she, you know, again, she's used to me doing random things in my yard. So the first year, I think she was a little bit skeptical, but then she, you know, asked me for some seed from, you know, some of the flowers that were coming up the next year. So, I think, of course, she would have preferred it to be kept lawn, but she's also fine with it too. So you may want to create a buffer, and that's for you to kind of work out with your neighbor. Of course, another question that I get is, you know, HOAs, you know, and I am zoned with the county and not with the city. And so I don't have, you know, I can remove my entire front lawn and remove grass from the entire front lawn. But again, check with your HOA requirements. If you need 60% of it in lawn, well, then keep that 60%, but make everything else into native. What were the other? Oh, yeah. So all of the grass got turned up onto this berm. In our case, you can haul it away if you want, but it's a resource that you have on your site. And depending on what else you are doing on your site, you may want to pile it into a big pile with the grass down, water it, cover it with a tarp and have it break down so that you can use that soil for some other project. So usually I try in my projects not to export materials that might be useful to me, like long-term off of the site. So I think it just depends on kind of overall goals for your site and what else you'll be doing on the site. Was there any other question, Beth? I forget.
That's pretty good. Someone was wondering if there's any way you could use a larger cursor on the screen, or maybe you could draw a circle with it when you're pointing to things.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway,
I will. Yeah.
I don't know if that's adjustable, but thank you. Go ahead.
I'll try my best. So this is, again, for step 4 is establish pathways, irrigation, and place plants. So I like to use this as a long tape measure. Here you can use a garden hose, right? You will have determined on your site plan your approximate pathway, but sometimes, you know, when you also start designing on the ground and making adjustments on the ground. So depending on whether you want a pathway through there, how big the space is, you'll want to define that first. You'll also, in my case, I used I have a friend who's a massage therapist, and she has to, you know, sometimes get rid of her sheets, right? Because they're covered in oil or whatever. So there's these organic cotton sheets that were free that I used for my pathways. You can, of course, use weed mat as well. I like to sometimes reuse materials that are out there that would otherwise maybe go to a landfill or something like that. You could also use cardboard. For the defining the pathways, but this is me starting to kind of place the plants and place the pathways and try to figure out, you know, there is adjustment that's always made on the ground. At this point, this would be a time to also put in your irrigation. So whether it's drip irrigation, whether it's netafim, or whether you have already, we had an existing overhead irrigation system, and I chose not to get too involved in snaking a bunch of netafim through here. You know, I made that choice of like a bunch of plastic, or, you know, knowing that over time I'm going to water less and less. So I actually do have an overhead watering system in here that I use very, very sparingly, especially now. I think this year I watered, and granted, we got a lot of rain in Bozeman this growing season, but I think I watered a total of 6 times. And so over time, you know, you're going to be watering less and less. So make that, you know, make that adjustment or that decision, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A as well. But you would, if you are going to do drip irrigation, which ultimately is a good move, right? That's when you would lay out your netafim or your drip irrigation around the plants. You place the plants kind of so that, you know, this is, you know, again, the pathway that's being created, and the plants, you know, in these 1-gallon pots, you know, rabbit brush and snowberries over here, more rabbit brush here, and some ornamental grasses, right? We're just kind of going along. My husband's there, you know, shaping the berm a little bit. And there's that oven still right in the corner there. And then we're putting down the mulch. So I get wood chip from a local arborist. Again, it's a free resource that otherwise might go to the landfill. So he dumps, you know, it's probably the equivalent of 20 yards of free wood chip on the site. And so I use that to define the pathways. And then you want to plant all of your plants on site, and, you know, make like a little mulch thing around your plants to conserve that water moisture. And you can see all of these 6-inch plugs that I'm kind of placing in certain areas. And then the last step is to be mindful about watering. Like I said, drip irrigation is preferable. Watering deeply and less frequently is also a good rule of thumb. Mulching any bare soil or planting ground covers, right? Nature abhors a vacuum, and we don't want any bare soil left on the site. You want to make sure that the shrubs and trees, they get adequate water for those first 3 to 4 years. And as the system matures, you'll be able to taper off how often you water. Right now, what I'm experimenting with is just watering the least amount possible and seeing what survives, you know, kind of survival of the fittest in terms of what species are going to continue to thrive or survive without me doing very much or me intervening very much. So this is kind of, again, a look at this place. This is September of 2018. We scraped the lawn and I planted these plants. This is July of 2020. So that's 2 growing seasons. So you can see that all of these, like this pale purple coneflower, this yarrow, this blanket flower, those were all 6-inch plugs. So things like that fill in pretty quickly. This is also that same year, July of 2020. That's the showy goldeneye right here. The the white sagebrush here, and obviously the blue flax. July 2020 still, just to give you an idea, that's that pathway, right? So it doesn't take long for a lot of this stuff to fill in. This is June 2021. There are seasons where it's just all blue. In June it's all blue, and then in July things pop a little bit more. This is July 2022. So 2 years after that, you can see that the pathway is slowly being taken over. I could maintain this pathway a lot more, but we don't, this just goes to my neighbors. And what's happened now is that stuff is self-seeding, right? You can aid that process along, right, by throwing down and collecting the seed at the end of the season and just throwing it down in other areas. And it also, of course, does that naturally. And then this is July 2023. I forgot this year to take a photo of the whole thing as you see it. So these are just videos. I do have a video of how I established this that we'll also put in the chat, where you can see like more video footage of this area. This is showy goldeneye, no, showy fleabane, which is just awesome. I would highly recommend it. So that's my quick and dirty in terms of how I established the site, and we can move into questions. But if you do want to learn more from me, just in general, I'll put a link to my newsletter. I do one-on-one consultations and garden design services. I've helped some clients go through this process of getting the rebate from the city and doing a design. And then I do run my Resilient Homestead program that starts next week. So definitely check that out. And thank you so much. There's my dog, my blue heeler dog, Benny, in the blue flax. But yeah, I'd love to get to questions and hear from you all about what questions you might have.
Oh gosh, thank you so much, Kareen. This is inspiring for all of us who endeavor to do what you've done, and it looks like you had some really beautiful success. There's tons of questions.
Okay.
And one that is out of order, but I just thought it might be good to say right now. Can you recall the total spending on the plants that you put in at the beginning?
Yeah, I want to say I can't totally recall it, but I would say it was probably around $500.
All right. Thank
Probably
you.
somewhere in that range. Yeah.
Great. And then people wondering, Andrea's wondering, do you feel like you dug deep enough to get rid of the grass roots? It seems like a lot of grass would have grown back. And how much weeding have you done? And did you have to herbicide it at all?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad somebody brought that up. So I did not use herbicide. I made the decision not to use herbicides. And as a result, of course, there is weeding, because there was, as you saw, that lawn, that house had been a rental before we took it on. And so there was a lot of thistle and dandelion. So there is weeding. What I've found is that things like the silver sage, or I don't know why keep on calling it silver sage. The white sagebrush definitely fills spaces. So does like the prairie coneflower. Some stuff really does take hold a little bit more and helps with that. The shrubs help outcompete the weeds as well, but there is a certain amount of maintenance. So I think it's weighing kind of how you feel about herbicides, what kind of time and energy you want to put into it, and yeah, those are some of the things that I would consider. I think since it is more native flowers, obviously I don't use herbicides and pesticides in my food growing, but I think it also, you want to measure how bad a thistle issue you might have, right? And how much maintenance that would take.
Sure. And a couple people have brought up deer, or wondering about deer resistant plants. And then, do you have deer browsing your plants, and did you consider that? Or
yes, I did. Totally. That's probably something that I should have mentioned in the plant section, is that most of those plants are deer resistant. So because that front yard area, the backyard area of my property is fenced, but that front yard area isn't. And so that was definitely a big decision in terms of what species I chose. They do occasionally, because I wanted the pale purple coneflower, they do occasionally munch on that. But that's the only thing that they seem to bother.
Great,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
And you have probably mostly white-tailed deer. I know someone was asking about mule deer down by Ennis, and I guess they have to do some research on that.
Yeah, yeah, it's whitetail.
Yeah, yeah. Are you using pine needles as mulch also? Someone asked.
I don't use pine needles. I, you know, I'd be curious. I think because we have such alkaline soil, I don't think using pine needles would be such a bad thing, or definitely using the pine needles for your pathways where you don't want stuff to grow anyway.
Mhm.
I think is a possibility for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then some questions about deadheading. Do you do that to prevent self-seeding? And then also, do you cut back the stems for the winter?
No, I leave it all up.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, for habitat. And yeah, I mean, I think I'm all about wildness for sure. So I don't mind when plants self-seed. I think that's their way of propagating, and it's just this kind of abundance that the natural world gifts us. So I think depending on your location, you could cut some of that back, but I recommend if you cut back, gift those seeds to friends or something like that who are also establishing their native gardens. But they I everything right now is up. I actually thought of taking a photo of it right now, right? It's up, it has its own kind of quality to it in
Nice.
the fall and winter. And then I'll just cut all that back, all of that stuff back in the spring.
Yeah, great, great. And a few people have been asking about thistle, and you've kind of explained how you're going about things, but I will point out that Jennifer Mahler has put a link in the chat she's with Grow Wild, and they have really good information about controlling invasives, and she knows a lot about Canada thistle. So if you go to the chat there, you go to growwildmontana.org, and they've got some specific things about Canada thistle because it is a bugger. So
Yeah, it definitely, and you could use, if you didn't want to use herbicide, and maybe Jennifer has some insight into this, you could do the agricultural vinegar potentially, or yeah, just cutting it back and lopping it off. If people aren't familiar with the Japanese rice knife as a way of quickly weeding, I highly recommend it. I can probably bring it up and put it in the chat as well. It's a very effective tool. And let
wow.
me too, while we're doing this, this is the outdoor rebate thing
Oh,
for those of
great.
you in Bozeman.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
this
nice.
my let's see, this is my newsletter sign up if you're interested in that.
And if you just click on these links right in the chat, it'll open the window for you, and it'll be open for you for later.
This is the video that you can actually see, where if you need a review of what I just went over, that's what you can use. And then this is also, I have another video that just goes over some of the plants that I used. Oh, Robin. Oh, I didn't know that Prairie Moon sells a rice knife tool. Awesome.
Right.
Yeah. Do you mind bringing it up, Robin, and putting it in the chat? That would be great. Any other questions?
Oh, there's a bunch. I'll go back.
Yeah.
Someone had asked early on about, can you plant over top a septic drain field? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so actually Prairie Moon has a septic safe pollinator mix.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously you don't want to plant woody perennials over top of a septic field, but there are, herbaceous perennials mostly are fine, or go to the Prairie Moon septic safe mix, and maybe if you just want natives, you can kind of go through the whole species list that they have and make your own mix, potentially if you don't want to use theirs. But yeah, they
Sure.
do have a septic safe mix.
Nice. And then Kim has her entire yard under trees and wondered about shade plant ideas.
Right. Yeah. I have less, what is it? What do you see? Oregon grape, alpine strawberries. Um, what else do you see in the native shade tolerant? I have less knowledge around that. Although the Water Smart planting guide that Bozeman has does have a lot of shade tolerant species in it. And I'm not sure if some of the people on here have more ideas of shade tolerant species.
Yeah. And Kareen, she put up our mtnativeplants.org. We have a lot of landscaping information. If you go into our native landscaping tab, and there's documents for different parts of the state, Southwest Montana or Helena or up by Kalispell, and a lot of recommendations. I know Linda Iverson just updated our one for Southwest Montana, and it has a really comprehensive list of plants, but then it has qualities about them, like needs full sun or deer resistant, or, there's a whole chart with some of those qualities. And I also know, like at Cashman's website, if you go in there, you can do a search and you can say it needs to be deer resistant and grow in shade and be a shrub or something like that. So we all are always doing our homework on these things.
And then Chaya, I think, were you mentioning Arnica as a shade tolerant native? I think maybe you were.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, and snowberry. Yeah, snowberry as well.
Those are great ideas. Yeah. Any tips for getting rid of non-native trees like plum trees, in my case, that keep spreading rhizomes into our native plant area? They keep coming back every year.
Yeah, I mean, beyond treating them. So again, like you've seen, I'm not a big fan of chemicals. So beyond treating them with chemicals, I would just, physically remove the suckers. Is usually, how I kind of keep on top of anything that spreads like that. That would be my recommendation. I mean, there are other and somebody might know, there are probably chemical ways that you can deal with those suckers.
Sure.
The
And of
other,
course,
the other thing too, to keep it, and maybe I'm going kind of a little bit tangential here, but sometimes we're like in permaculture, there's an expression forcing function. And so that's when, choosing the right site. For those of you, like I know that you already have the native plant section already in there, but for those of you who are choosing sites, like be conscious of, like, if you have an aspen grove and you're wanting to put a native garden there, that's probably not going to work, right? Like the aspen want to become a grove, and so you're constantly going to be battling that. And so in permaculture, there's this thing of forcing function. Are you forcing function in the site that you choose? Right? Is the input that you put in to your landscape worth the yield that you're getting out, and always measuring that. So yeah, being mindful of the site that you choose, and whether you're constantly going to be kind of running up against a problem issue that's going to be a lot of maintenance for you.
sure. And Shiva's mentioning the Center for Native Plants, which is up in Whitefish. They have a really good website plant selection page. So you can do it by shade, deer resistant, drought tolerant. And she put the link in the chat there.
Awesome.
And then Kathy's asking about using blue grama grass.
Like as an option, or like,
yeah, I know, you had 3 grasses in yours, and from my experience, I think grama grass is a great grass to mix into that type of a situation. And I know some people get it as plugs, and some people might seed with it. And I don't have any personal experience with it, but it's certainly a real workhorse grass that does really well in Montana. If anybody wants to chime in, feel free.
Yeah. I mean, I like the differences in kind of the textures too of grasses versus the wildflowers too, just always having this kind of mix of diversity, not only of diversity of wildflowers, but diversity of different types of plants in your landscape makes it more interesting for the non-humans and for the humans.
Yeah. And she was giving a big vote for Blue Grandma. She says it's
Woohoo!
drought tolerant, really pretty in the fall, and has an interesting seed head. Use it. So that's a pretty good vote for it. Yeah.
That's great.
All right. And at this point, I always, it's so hard to keep track because the chat keeps moving along, and I miss people's questions. And so if I've missed your question and you don't feel heard, we're happy for people to unmute themselves and ask questions at this point. Does anyone want to chime in and ask a question?
Yeah, this is Christy. My biggest enemy is these weedy rhizomatous grasses. And I don't know if it's quack grass or what it is, but anytime, to prepare my flower beds originally, I had to double dig them to get all the little rhizomes out, and I had to go down about a foot or foot and a half. And no matter what I do, they just come back. And weeding in my yard is, once everything dries up, I do it with a rock hammer because there's a lot of clay. So and I put in soil amendments and it helps for a year or two, but any suggestions?
I know that's a really tough one. I think you're always constantly maintaining an edge, right? Is that kind of what's going on?
Yeah, and I put in plastic barriers, and this stuff goes under it. And and Robin's right. It might be smooth brome,
right?
Or some, we've got, Missoula is the weed capital of Montana. It's and so it's right now I just have flower beds around the house because the rest of my yard's just too shady. But even just keeping the grass out of it, I think it probably makes up a lot of the lawn anymore, and we just mow it. But I don't know. I've had trouble trying to figure out what to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is a tough one. Rhizomatous grasses are tough. I mean, some of it, depending on the context, like right now, say in my front lawn, what used to be my front lawn, there are some grasses that are coming up, but I'm kind of just accepting that some of that's going to be how it is. So I think part of it, sometimes in your case, it might be a little bit different. For me, it's just kind of like, okay, there's a mixture of different things going on here. And again, the input in of my time of trying to remove this grass every single year is not worth the output out. So kind of weighing how wild that area is in terms of visually and aesthetically and how you want it to look, and weighing, what, whether that's worth your time commitment.
It's not matter of looks. It's, if I have a back garden, the flower bed that I just let go for a number of years because I was having back trouble and other health issues, and it was all behind a plastic barrier from what we were mowing. But it basically, all the flowers I had in there just disappeared. There were a couple of penstemons left that survived in that grass barely, but I mean it just took out, it outcompeted all the wildflowers I had in there, and I had to redo the entire flower bed.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And I think that's something to keep in mind just in terms of like maintenance time and or staying on top of maintenance. I talk a lot about this with my clients and in design work. It's like, be conscious of the social systems design that you build around kind of your maintenance around your house and or your landscape, right? Allow for enough time for all of those things, because otherwise they can quickly get out of control. Or if you don't have the capability, if your back is out 1 year and then suddenly things go awry. So I think thinking about, I like to say, are there work parties that you can hold? Can you get help? Are there certain contexts where if you do have the resources, you can pay somebody to have you get like a handle on it early in the season so it doesn't become such a bear, later in the season. So kind of thinking through that social systems design of how you're going to maintain this. And as a result, if you don't have that social systems design, taking on a smaller patch of land, right?
Yeah. Well, let's,
Yeah,
Kathy Powell has a question. She's raised her hand. So Kathy.
Yes, hi, Kareen. I have a question. So mule deer versus white deer, and I know mostly what you have is white deer, but they eat different things.
Mhm.
And is there a reference you could suggest, or the folks from the Montana, well, I'm a member of the Montana Plant Society too, but would have a list of that too. I've done research on it. It's hard to find from what I've looked at, but they do tend to, some, I think the mule deer eat more woody stuff than the whitetail, but any suggestions would be appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy, for that question. I do not have, because everything's put into that like very broad category of deer resistant, which is unfortunate. I would say if you're concerned, and please, again, crowdsourcing, if anybody knows, please put it in the chat. But I would say if you're at all concerned, you could do small little, you know, welded wire to protect those shrubs for the first few years, if that's what you're mostly concerned about. But I don't know of a good resource offhand that's just specifically speaking to mule deer. I'm not sure if somebody, have you asked it, Cashman?
A little bit, but not thoroughly.
Yeah.
This is actually for our son who lives by Ennis Lake, and it's hotter there, drier there, sandier there, and his is fenced, but it's not high enough, and he'll
Right.
have 20-25 mule deer in his yard every day.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, I mean it's a taller fence is probably the way to go with that.
Yeah. So Nancy pointed out, consider being firewise with native garden trees and brush, and especially really adjacent to the house. And that is a great point. And there's a lot of information. If you Google firewise landscaping, there's a lot of information available. And then Susie was pointing out, if anyone feels overwhelmed by the cost of native plants, they winter sowed about 25 different species, 600 plants in the last couple of years. And it's a fair bit of work, but they're slowly filling their acre. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely, I could have, if I would have, sowed a lot of stuff myself, I could have definitely saved money there. So if that's something that you have the time and the energy for, by all means, for sure. But I think the plugs really does cut down on the cost too, like being particular about what you buy as 1-gallon pots, because of course those are probably the most, beyond the shrubs, those are the most expensive. But yeah, always, with a landscape plan, weigh your time, your budget, really closely, and kind of your ability for maintenance as well, in terms of, and of course, the money that you would maybe put into like irrigation as well.
And someone did mention spraying. They've had success with spraying their plants with deer out every 2 weeks. And there are repellents and people use them. I see Donna has raised her hand. Donna, do you have a question?
I do, not a question. I just want to give a shout out for free seed source. Many county extension services. Here would be Sanders County Extension Services and Lake County Extension Services have a free seed pollinator packet that I have used. And I had to put it in my far corner of my yard that I didn't water, particularly did not water. Spring cleared the area, spring planting. No, they did not want any supplemental water. And after 3 years, it's looking pretty darn good. I have had it fenced because I have deer doing battle, bucks doing battle in my yard every night. But the following spring, I'm going to take off the fence and they're going to tough it out. And I'm going to expand that corner from there. So free pollinator packets through your county extensions.
Awesome. Yes, thank you, Donna, for mentioning that, because the Gallatin Conservation District has a pollinator initiative where they were giving free seed as well.
And then Christy was wondering if the Bozeman brochure is available online. And I think maybe she's referring to the city of Bozeman thing. So I told her yes in the chat, right?
Is it the water? Are you meaning the
Water-wise?
The water smart planting guide, I assume?
Yeah, the water smart planting guide.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's online.
I can probably pull it up for you here in a minute, maybe.
And then Linda Iverson pointed out that our Valley of Flowers chapter in Bozeman is planning a native plant garden tour next season. So watch for more info on our website. And it's always fun to visit different gardens to get some inspiration. So that's great.
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. There's the Bozeman Waterwise plant guide.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, oh, that's fun. Awesome. Thanks.
So many resources, you guys.
I know it's
yeah, and many people earlier had chimed in with different places to get plants, plant sales, and the Tizer Botanical Garden and Piplio Natives and Missoula and Center for Native Plants. And also on our website is our native plant source guide, and that's a concise document that has by location around the state who sells native plants. And that was just updated last year. So that's there. And Linda says it would be fun to visit Kareen's yard.
Yes, you're welcome, Linda.
We'll have to work
You're
on
welcome
that.
to come, come visit. This is that Montana native plant pollinator friendly plants resource online.
Oh, great. Great.
And then for those of you, I think people got, I put in my videos, I think this is also from on my website. There's a bunch of different resources. They're not necessarily related to native plants, but there's a bunch of
yeah, and you can get to from Kareen's website, brokengroundpermaculture.com. There's just many directions you can go. She's got so many great resources. Yeah. Anyone else want to ask a question? I think I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.